Welcome back to the channel, everyone, and if it's your first time here, then an extra welcome. This is my top 100 most anticipated games coming in 2022. If you've been watching the series from the beginning, then you've already seen me talk about my 10 honorable mentions and my 50 top expansions and later editions of games that have already been produced. In fact, in the last video in the series, I went back and realized there were a few expansions and later editions that were still labeled as 2021, even though they didn't actually ship out in 2021, which means they were now going to be 2022 games. And several of these were games that I definitely didn't want to leave off my list. So I supersized the second half of that list. I made it 30 games instead of 20. My top 40 expansions became 50. If you haven't seen me talk about those 60 games yet, the 10 honorable mentions and the 50 expansions and later editions, you can look down below in the description section and find links to those videos. And from here, we're just going to soldier on and begin with the first 20 games in this 100 game list of my 100 most anticipated games of 2022. We'll start in alphabetical order at the top with the numbers, and this video will take us through to the Arkeis. Let's get started. Citadel ran on Kickstarter in October of 2020. It's sort of a pseudo sequel to the Seventh Continent. It is a game that I personally backed, and right now it is being slated to deliver in December of this year. Now, this game is also by the same designers, same artists, same publisher over at Serious Pulp. In fact, if you look at the game, you will see that the card art looks very similar. It uses the same kind of iconography, the same graphic design layout. It literally looks like a sequel game. However, this new game takes place in a post-apocalyptic fantasy medieval world. So it's a fictional world, whereas the first game was really supposed to be set in our world with players playing some real and fictional characters mishmashed together, characters from lore and storytelling. So whereas the first game was rooted more in 1800s or even turn of the century pulp, this new game is in its own fantasy world. Now, it's going to have similar types of gameplay. It will use similar iconography, and players will be using that iconography to solve and trigger puzzles. However, there are new types of mechanics and components in Seventh Continent, including a sort of atlas, a map, that players will mark their progress in as they go. And to me, overall, it looks like the Seventh Citadel is going to have sort of less wandering around aimlessly and less repetition. That was kind of a hallmark of the Seventh Continent, where depending on which quest you started with, you might go into this world, explore a little piece of it, and solve a puzzle, and then do the same thing, and then the same thing, and then go into it later and have an enormous part of this world to explore, which you've already seen through these smaller quests, and then you could kind of find your way through it and solve puzzles. If you did the opposite way around, you'd be wandering through this giant world the first time there, trying to solve the bigger quest, and once you map the world and spent a long time solving that big central quest, you could then go in later and do little kind of mini curses using different parts of the island. But either way, there was a lot of just exploring aimlessly until you kind of mapped everything out and knew what it was. And also when you were solving certain puzzles, especially the bigger ones, there was a gameplay like in Time Stories where you would go through, you would solve it as best you could, you would die, and then you would need to start over, speed through it as much as you could with the knowledge that you had from your past scenario, and get to the point where you'd left off and then just continue on, kind of like a roguelike. The difference was that there was no randomization, but you did have to replay things often. and try to replay them more efficiently than you did in the past. So it was this evolving, very repetitive puzzle. It looks to me from what I've seen that the 7th Citadel is streamlining that to some degree, offering less repetition and more exploration and puzzles and ways of kind of tracking those puzzles, maybe in something like Sleeping Gods, so that you know where you've been before and you know what you've done, and over a larger campaign you're trying to kind of piecemeal everything together. So I'm a huge fan of 7th Continent, even with its repetition. I think that this game looks like a very interesting jump forward, and it's something that I am really looking forward to playing and seeing exactly how it does play, and if some of my assumptions about gameplay based on what I've seen do end up proving true. Aeon Trespass Odyssey was a huge undertaking and a Kickstarter that funded initially in September of 2019. It is something that I personally backed, and originally the game was supposed to deliver in 2 waves, in January and December of 2021. Now, we are well past both of those dates. In fact, we're over a year past that original January 2021 delivery date. So the dates that are now being earmarked are April of 2022 and probably March of 2023. Now, this game is a huge design undertaking that looks like it's comparing things like the storytelling of games like the 7th Continent and Sleeping Gods with the combat and boss fights of stuff like Kingdom Death Monster. In fact, they list the game as being a cooperative campaign with adventure, exploration, narrative choice, and fierce tactical combat battles with giant monsters. I think 2 other games you might want to throw into the mix are games like Tainted Grail and Etherfields, but again, with a focus on some of these big boss battles. Now, thematically, the game has players playing Argonauts in ancient Greece, so the creatures and the battles that they're going to be fighting fit under that thematic guise. And if you got deep into the campaign like I did, there were just a lot of upgrades, ways to upgrade the tiles of the game into these very nice chunky wooden tiles, and there were 5 different cycles of content, so sort of 5 storytelling acts that were going to ship over 2 waves. For some comparison, Midara is 3 acts, so this is 5 acts. I can't say if those acts are similar in size, but there are sort of 5 different storytelling cycles, each of which is going to have a different story, different campaign elements, some different components, and kind of be its own big arc. Now, to me, this is the kind of game that when it launched, I looked at it, I saw the ambition here by some new designers and a publisher, and I saw what they were trying to do and how much work they'd done so well. And it was a case of, okay, I'm just going to jump on board this crazy machine and we'll see if this game ever delivers. And it's been progressing, I think, more slowly than some. It did launch in 2019, and I think this is one of the most ambitious games, maybe one of the most ambitious games that I've backed on Kickstarter. And this was ambitious, full of potential problems even before the pandemic and all of the backups at the factories and shipping and distributors and things like that. So it's not really surprising to me that it's taken this long for this game to get delivered. And I'm hoping it will come out this year, at least the first wave of it. I do believe that I signed up for this one with 2-wave shipping, and so I will be getting the first part of the game when it ships. It is something that I hope to heavily feature on my channel and eventually on my Twitch channel when I get that up and running later in the year. And I mentioned before when I was doing my expansions that I thought the Midara series was going to be the big dungeon crawling series of the 2020s. This game looks super ambitious too, and I think with Midara, they've already had their first game ship. People have played it, they really love it, so they've got sort of a foothold. They've got something now to build on. Aeon Trespass Odyssey has not delivered its first wave yet, so it's still kind of operating in this void where a lot of gamers out there don't know about it, just the ones who found it initially on Kickstarter. So I'm really curious to see what kind of sound this is going to land with, and if it's going to appeal to backers beyond the initial Kickstarter, and if maybe, I think with something this big they certainly can, if maybe they'll come back to Kickstarter later, do another campaign if this first one is successful, and they can get more people on board as they head into the second wave of shipping and just get more copies of this game out and around the world, because it's ambitious and there's a lot to it, And it deserves to be seen and played probably by a lot more people than were on board with that first initial Kickstarter. Agemonia launched on Kickstarter in September of 2021. It is another game that I personally backed, and they are currently set to deliver in December of this year. Now, there are a lot of these big dungeon crawlers and kind of narrative choice-based games that have been on Kickstarter within the last year or two. I think perhaps there's been even more of a push for these kinds of games during the pandemic, when you've got people stuck in a living quarters together and maybe a smaller number of players playing games. So maybe you're not having the same big groups getting together to play lots of heavy Euros, but you may have 1 or 2 or 3 friends getting together to play games. And since they're kind of sequestered somewhat over a longer period of time, I think campaign games have become more attractive to some people than they have in the past. They now are in a place where it's something that seems like a good option for them. Agemonia is another one of these games. It is being produced by the same team that did the new version of Eclipse, Second Dawn of the Galaxy, so that immediately generated a little interest from me. The designers and artists themselves aren't as well known. That's kind of an unknown factor. But this cooperative campaign has 30 different scenarios, which makes for quite a long campaign, and it promises challenging moral choices set in an expansive storyline. That sounds pretty cool and pretty compelling to me. Some of the gameplay involves players taking choices, and when they need to, making ability checks, and players will also have actions, kind of like action points available to them to do different things. And the way this game works is that as the characters level up, they'll get more and more action points, so as they become more powerful, they'll be able to do more and more things on a given turn. There are also things like initiative cards in the deck that'll be used to determine which characters or NPCs go first, and a clock deck that will track characters' progress through the game. Now, sometimes with games, if they grab my interest early and I see elements that I really, really like, I tend to not investigate those games as thoroughly as others sometimes. Think of it as the same kind of mentality as if there's a movie coming out that you really know that you want to see, maybe you're not going to go out and watch every single trailer because maybe you don't want to spoil yourself. And so in my look at Agemonia, I felt like I got enough to know that the game was compelling to me and something that I wanted to take a chance on. But I didn't want to look any further beyond kind of what I've already talked about, the mechanics. I wanted the game to be fresh so that I could experience it when it eventually ships to me. But Agemonia is one of many campaign games that I think you'll find on this list that I should be acquiring over the next year or two. And I look very forward to sharing with all of you as I play it together, either with my fiance Kristen or some other friends on Twitch. That is something I am very much looking forward to moving into in the future. The Twitch channel with live plays, sometimes Euro games, sometimes solo games, sometimes kind of playing through a big box game with various expansions and modular expansions to see how I like everything, and also journeying through campaign games with hopefully you all in for the trip. Amsterdam was on Kickstarter in September of 2020, and again, this is something that I personally backed. Right now, they're looking at delivering this game in February, and this is part of a new series from Queen Games called the Stefan Feld Collection. Now, some of these games are redesigns of previous games, like Amsterdam is a redesign of Macau. Now, I've played Macau in the past. It features players using action points for set collection, and they're moving their ships around a board. There is a modular resource wheel that they'll be using, and it works also like the resource wheel in Barrage, if you've ever played that, where you're going to put certain resources down in your wheel, and then as you turn it, you'll get those resources on the turn that they come back around and kind of show up being pushed out of that wheel. Now, Macau is currently Stefan Feld's 9th highest rated game. He just has a lot of very well rated games. I mean, some other designers don't have 9 games, period, but you can have Feld, who has that many games that are really good games and still many more after that. But Macau was originally published back in 2009. We're hitting 13 years later, so it seems like maybe it's time for a bit of a retheme and an upgrade in components. And that's something that Queen Games is doing through the production of this version, now called Amsterdam. Ark Nova is a new retail game coming from Capstone Games. We'll talk more about that in a minute. It is a game that I pre-ordered because it's being published by Capstone Games. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And it's currently scheduled to hit stores in March of this year. Now, I don't know too much about the artists or the designers. I believe this is a first published game for most of them. If it's not a first published game, then it's a first big published game, first game by a big publisher. And again, that publisher is Capstone Games. So here's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about Ark Nova. Capstone has just been destroying it. They are now my favorite retail publisher. I pretty much have every game pre-ordered that they're publishing this year that I know about. That includes things like Maracaibo, the expansion, Boonlake, which is another new Alexander Pfister game. I have a new game of theirs that already hit retail coming soon called Corrosion. The list just goes on and on. I also have the Ride the Rail series with some expansion maps coming because they do that whole series, the Iron Gauge series. That also includes Irish Gauge and Iberian Gauge. Capstone has just been making so many good games from great designers, published at retail with a really good design sensibility and a good amount of production behind it with good components. I really think you could almost blind buy anything by Capstone Games and be in fairly safe hands. I think right now they are my favorite retail publisher, probably followed by Osprey Games. Now, what I do know about this game, which is not too much, is that it does feature players being architects of new kinds of zoos. And there's going to be, and it's a heavy Euro, there's going to be a lot of thinking and planning going into that. Some of that is sort of a green initiative in zoos. For instance, I know that one thing in reality that's becoming bigger is not using fencing for zoos, but constructing the lands in such a way that they kind of encapsulate the animals and hold them in just in the way that land is designed. So I think that's the kind of thing that you're going to be looking at in Ark Nova, is how do you design zoos in ways that are advantageous for everyone, for the money behind the zoos, for the people running the zoos, for the animals themselves, and for the world. And all of that sounds really fascinating, and I like all of that being baked into a heavy Euro. The game's also going to feature card drafting and hand management, and of course tile placement as you build your zoo. Every player is going to be building their own personal zoo. Arkeis launched in Kickstarter in November of 2019. Originally it was supposed to deliver in December of 2020. They've obviously missed that date by more than a year. And their current date, which I've looked up, I've tried to find kind of more information because this is not something that I personally backed. So it's not something that I was as on top of as other games. The best information that I can find right now is simply that this is slated to deliver in 2022. So the publishers have not yet kind of narrowed down on a specific month or even a quarter yet. But they are saying that it will deliver in 2022. Now, this is a cooperative, story-driven campaign game. It came out at a time where there were just a lot of these, and you'll see the evidence of that by all the other games that I did back, including a couple that I've already talked about in this list. And it just becomes a case of you can't back everything. I think this was also out at the same time as Ankh, Gods of Egypt, and they have a similar kind of Egyptian theme to them, and I think I was trying to decide between them at one point. I ultimately ended up not backing either one for various reasons. So this game, in addition to being Egyptian themed, so it features archaeologists who are exploring an Egyptian tomb, it also has a theme where those archaeologists are Victorian steampunk themed. I like the idea of steampunk kind of fantasy, that level of fantasy coming into Egyptian exploration. It felt really cool to me. One of the designers, Ludovic Montblanc, is the designer of Cyclades and Conan. Another of the designers, Antoine Bauza, has designed stuff like Seven Wonders and Ghost Stories and Hanabi and Takenoko. And those are some kind of light family games for the most part. I mean, they have really good strategy, and Ghost Stories is absolutely relentless. But some of those other games, Hanabi, Takenoko, and Seven Wonders, those are very kind of medium light, family friendly fare, which when I looked at this made me think that with this group of designers, it maybe is going to be something a little bit lighter than I want. It does have a cooperative campaign, which I love. I love games like that. But I thought that with this game, it might be a little too insubstantial. You know, it might be a short campaign and very kind of light. So I just decided to pass on it at the time, figuring I could catch up on it later. And if it was really successful, maybe they'd end up launching a follow-up second sequel Kickstarter campaign in the future. Often that happens, and often when publishers do that, they include the first game content as well. And sometimes there's even an additional bonus to that because you're getting everything sent to you at once, so you're paying one shipping charge for both games, or one game and all of its expansion content. So Arkeis is not a game that I personally backed, but it is a game that I'm very curious about and very interested in. And I don't know if I'll be able to get my hands on it to be able to play it. I really want to try to, but I probably won't try that hard if over the course of this year, while this game is in the process of delivering and being distributed, we hear about a follow-up campaign. I think if that happens, I'll probably just back that follow-up campaign. Again, it may depend on what other things are out on Kickstarter that month and the month around it. I need to be able to have the funds to back it. But it's something that I do have an eye towards backing in the future, especially if I'm not able to get a copy and play the game the first time around. So we'll see as that game delivers. Artisans of Splendent Vale was on Kickstarter in October of 2021. This is a game that I personally backed, and it is currently scheduled to deliver in October of this year. Now, this is a game designed by Nikki Valens, who has designed a lot of cooperative campaign-y type games, including Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, Eldritch Horror, Legacy of Dragonholt, and Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition. I believe Nikki also uses the pronoun they, and they are very supportive of LGBTQ plus causes and characters and diversity in general, which is why that is a hallmark of this specific game. So it has a very diverse cast of characters that you can choose to play. It's being billed as a cooperative adventure and storytelling game, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to resolve the maybe idea of it being a dungeon crawler. I don't think that it's a dungeon crawler, but if it's just kind of people around a town and doing things, how do you bring the gameplay into that, right? If there's no combat, if there's no monster. Because I'm not sure that you are fighting monsters or there's any kind of combat in Artisans of Splendent Vale. What I do know is that the game has crafts that individual characters can learn. So you are still going to be leveling up your character and learning different kinds of abilities with them. And I also know that the game is going to be using those characters to overcome challenges during tactical action scenes. So what I think this game is doing is, rather than taking a kind of storytelling game with a bunch of characters who go into a dungeon or on a big quest or a mission to kill a lot of things, I think that this game is telling a different kind of story that's more around characters working together, maybe building something, and that the gameplay in this is going to be doing some kind of mechanics to fulfill these challenges. So it doesn't always have to be combat. And I think that in this game, it's going to be taking some kind of mechanics that you might normally find in combat, and applying them to physical challenges and kind of changing the nature of what we see in storytelling fantasy adventure games. And that seems very exciting to me, something new that hasn't really been done before. This game is also being published by Renegade Game Studios, who throughout their life have been a co-publisher of games like the Clank series and the Of the West Kingdom and Of the North Sea series. They've published a lot of really good games and they have a high pedigree behind them. And I think when you put Renegade together with Nikki Valens, you're going to get a really good playable game. And again, this is something that I haven't wanted to look into too closely because I want to be surprised by it when it delivers. And I've already gotten enough from what I've seen to know that this is something that I wanted to back and wanted to play. So again, hopefully this is something that I'll be able to feature on my eventual Twitch channel and be able to share with all of you as we play it. Arydia, The Paths We Dare Tread, was originally on Kickstarter in August of 2021. This is a game that I personally backed, and it is currently slated to deliver in December of this year. Now, I'm saying December for some of these games. Almost without a doubt, at least half of those games will end up getting pushed into 2023, perhaps all of them, because of what's still going to be going on with production delays and shipping delays and distributor delays, in the States. Those things are all going to have problems, I think, over the course of the coming year. We're just hoping that those problems will become fewer and less until they are eventually somewhat resolved. But I don't think that they will be fully resolved by the end of the year. So just blanket statement, I am remaining hopeful that all or most of these December 2022 games deliver on time this year. But I do acknowledge that it may be madness to believe that all or most will. So I'm happily creating this list with some of these games in it. I'm just remaining hopeful that they will actually ship in 2022. So this is another game that is sort of a campaign game. This one is listed as an open world, campaign-based, cooperative, fantasy-based, green legacy, role-playing board game. So I just talked about another game that I think is trying to be green in some of its elements, literally in the design of the game. This game, Green Legacy, what that means is that there will be a campaign that players can play, and they will be doing things, I think, on the board to change things around a little bit, but it won't be permanent, as with a legacy game. So whatever you do in this to kind of set your campaign as you're playing, it will be fully resettable. So that's what they mean by Green Legacy. It's not a game where you're going to play through it, you're going to destroy things, and when you finish, the game's no good, you have to just chuck it and throw it out. This will be a game that once you are done with the campaign, you can fully reset it. You can play it yourself again if you want to, maybe with a different game group, or you could give it to somebody else and they would be able to play the game fully through and not have to deal with, elements that have been destroyed by you and your game group. So that is what is meant by Green Legacy in this case. Now the game does promise over 40 hours of campaign. And another thing that I think is very cool about this game is that it comes with 60 pre-painted miniatures. And this is something that you're seeing more and more in games. There are gamers like me who spend enough time already gaming and maybe creating video content, so I don't really have the time to do miniatures painting on top of everything else. I do like painted miniatures though. So if there are games that offer me painted miniatures and it's not too much of a price jump, sometimes I will go ahead and do that. I did that with Cerebria, which was from Mind Clash. They had a version with pre-painted miniatures. Now I can't remember completely, but I do believe that the pre-painted miniatures in this campaign are just a status quo. I don't think there were different levels where you could have this on. I think if you are backing this game, you are getting the pre-painted miniatures. And I have to admit, for me, I really like that idea. It's much more immersive just to have everything painted from the beginning and to be able to play the game and have the characters look like they fit in that world instead of having them be these bland gray minis. I like that. I find that very appealing. And I think if more games are able to include an option with pre-painted miniatures, either by default or as an add-on, where it's not just an out-of-control expense, that is definitely something that I'll be looking to include in my own pledge in the future. The last thing that has me excited about this game is that it's designed by Cody Miller, who did Zia Legends of a Drift system. And that is a game that I think was fairly popular when it shipped after it was on Kickstarter, but it's a game that I keep hearing people talking about as time goes on. So it continues to find more fans and a bigger fan base. And in fact, in this campaign, you were also able to order all the Zia Legends of a Drift system stuff as well, and that's something that I did. That's not a game that I owned previously. It's a game that I've been hearing about and wanting to get, so I used this campaign to also get the Zia Legends of the Drift system stuff. But I'm really looking forward to Arydia. I think there are a lot of really cool looking big campaign games coming over the next year or two, and I'm very curious to see how they all stack up against each other and to see how certain games may take certain things and run with it in one direction, and other games may do something in a different way. Beast was on Kickstarter in October of 2021, which is fairly recently. Now, this is not a game that I backed, and it is currently slated to deliver in November of this year. So again, this is kind of a situation where as many games as I do back, which has been a lot, and a lot of what I'm backing is because I am getting games to feature on my channel. I'm going out there and I'm acquiring the resources for this channel to be able to show you games and play games and review games kind of on my own. I'm going out and kind of building my business here by acquiring a lot of these games. I do know quite a bit about games and I do love games, so it's great that I get to play them as well, but this is kind of resource gathering. It is business expenses in a way. Nevertheless, I can't back everything. And at the time that Beast was out, I was backing a lot of different things, and for whatever reasons, this didn't completely click with me. But there are a lot of things in it that look compelling. One of the things that may have kept me away is that it is by first-time designers and a first-time publisher. And they are Aaron Midhall, Elon Midhall, and the studio that these two brothers have together called Studio Midhall. Now, I may have been a little more hesitant to back it because of that, but I can tell you that I'm really impressed by these guys. And I think in the future, there's no reason they can't become a team like the Carlsons, who do chip theory games and have some great games like Too Many Bones, Hoplomachus coming up soon, Burncycle, Cloudspire. I think these guys are starting and they're doing a great job their first time out with Beast. The other thing that probably kept me away is that as many elements as there were that I liked about this game, it is at the end of the day sort of a deduction and hidden movement game, and that's not really my favorite type of game. But if you like those kinds of games, if you like Whitehall Mystery or Fury of Dracula, then pay attention because this game looks like it is going to kill them all. So it's got deduction, it's got hidden movement, it's got these fantasy beasts that some players are going to be hunting. It really kind of dives deep into that theme, so there's a horror side to it as well. It gets a little dark, and there's asymmetrical drafting. Now, while there is an element of this kind of deduction, there is also going to be an element of boss fighting, kind of like Kingdom Death Monster or Aeon Trespass Odyssey. And it also takes a page from some recent video games where players are kind of working together to take down a monster together, going hunting. So this game combines that kind of monster hunting with the deduction element, and it's also a one versus many game. So one of the players is going to be playing the beast, and there are several different beasts to choose from. They're all going to have different kinds of abilities, different skills that they can use, and different ways that they can hide. And then the other players are going to be trying to find and hunt that beast. Part of the gameplay is going to be deduction and hidden movement, but part of that will be players using their own special abilities to find ways to trap and kill this particular monster. So it's kind of combining all of those things together into this mishmash of a game. We haven't seen anything quite like that before, and so it definitely has my attention. I'm very curious to see the game. I'd really like to play it. I didn't back it, so I'm going to have to try to hunt the game down once the game arrives and see if I can get my fingers on it and get a play in. I do think that the mid-halls are going to be around for a while, making more and more games, so there may be a chance for me to, if I'm not able to find it and play it, either back it through a future campaign if they return to it, or possibly if they do a different game and they offer this one as an add-on, I could procure it that way. If I find out once it gets into the wild and I see more about gameplay, if I realize that this really is a game for my collection. Right now I'm a little bit on the fence as to whether it would be a game for my collection, but it is definitely a game that I want to play. Bitoku is a retail game, and I am calling this a 2022 game. Now, it's been out in the world a little bit. I'm not sure. It may have come out in other countries in 2021. I do know that there were a select number of stores in the Northeast in the United States that got Bitoku very, very late in 2021, in December. The rest of the stores in the Northeast and all of the stores in the rest of the United States will not get any copies of Bitoku until 2022, so I'm just flat out considering this a 2022 game, even though you may have seen a few people playing it and some videos up and around. So that's why there were people, I think, out in the world and definitely in some parts of the US that were able to get it. Most people are not able to get it yet. Now, the game is designed by Germain Milan. I don't know too much about him. I believe this is his first big published game. It does have a solo mode by David Turksey, who is a designer that I love. and he sort of has this side business doing solo modes. He does a lot of solo modes, and I generally really like his solo modes. But what I really find compelling about this game so far is the theme. So players are going to be playing Bitoku, or Spirits of the Forest, and they're going to be interacting with yokai and kodamas and human pilgrims and trying to evolve themselves into becoming the next great spirit of the forest. And I like that idea. I like this kind of fantasy theme to it that has to do with Bitoku and yokai and kodama. That isn't a theme that we see so much, at least here in the United States and the West. So it's got this fantasy theme to it, but it's a different kind of fantasy theme than we've been inundated with. And mechanically, this is an engine building game, but it features things like hand management, it's got worker placement with dice workers, and it's got set collection. And I just know from sort of my fellow gamers out there who are also really into heavy Euro games, this is already a game that is, very kind of in my sights in a very narrow way, probably in my top 10 of the year. This is, if I have 10 retail games that I'm looking at this year that I'm really focused on, this is one of those 10. Blood on the Clocktower was originally on Kickstarter in April of 2019. So much so long ago that I remember back then seeing Shut Up and Sit Down do videos on it back in late 2018, because I think they had, working production copies. And then in early 2019 when the Kickstarter campaign was actually live. Currently, this game is slated for delivery in May of this year. So I did not personally back it. I haven't really been on top of this campaign. I don't know why the delay was that long. It didn't look like it had that much in it to produce. So it seems like a very long delay in this Kickstarter, but I am interested in it. And the reason is, well, in addition to Shut Up and Sit Down, really, really loving it to the point that Quinn's and another reviewer saying it was possibly now their favorite board game of all time, period. It takes that formula that you find in games like Mafia and the Werewolf games, and it expands upon them. And I think those are games that we've all played. They generally tend to be games that I don't really love. I like games with heavy strategy where you really kind of sit down and think through your moves, and there's a lot of kind of player agency. I'll play these kind of hidden role type games once in a while, but they're not the games that I love. So the fact that I even have this game on this list is saying something about this game. I do also know that the sweet spot for this game is like 8 to 13 people. So if you're trying to play it with a smaller group, of like 5 or so, or if you have groups of people of like 20 plus, this game isn't going to work so well with it. It's going to really work well in that kind of core group of 7 to 8 to 13, something around in there. It's a deduction game, it's a party game, it's a bluffing game. But what makes this so special is that there are a couple players in the game that are demons, and then there are a lot of variable player roles. And I think since 2019, Werewolf has addressed this more and more, and they've kind of put out more expansions with more player roles. But this still takes the gameplay in a way, I think, away from some of the simplicity of Werewolf. So players each are going to have their own set of rules. There will be a day phase and a night phase. And at the end of each night phase, going back into the day phase, the human players will get to take a vote and they will get to assassinate somebody. And they can do that if they have majority vote. And that means that they're slowly going to be killing people off of the island, like it's Survivor. And if they get down to the place that there are only 2 people left, one of them is a demon, the other one is a human, the demons win. What makes this game a little bit different, though, is that when players are killed, they're not necessarily out of the game. They can still talk and listen and participate because they become ghosts. These ghosts, who may have been human, may have been murdered by their other humans erroneously, still have a voice in the game. And they may be upset that they were killed erroneously. And every ghost will be able to participate in one more vote in the game, which leads often from what Shut Up and Sit Down says to situations where wronged ghosts are kind of all carrying these grudges and bring that onto the still remaining humans, the kind of weight of those choices. And so as things kind of ramp into the end of the game and the ghosts all want to get their revenge, but they may actually be wrong in their assumptions, it can create a lot of drama. Also, one thing that Shut Up and Sit Down really stresses is that unlike werewolf games where it creates kind of a divide in players, all becoming neurotic and blaming each other, that happens in this game too to some degree. But there's also a level of kind of family, people working together behind a common cause in a way that is not in the gameplay of those other games, just from the way that this game is instructed with the kinds of roles in this game and the way they work. And the fact that ghosts get to stay until the end and have a voice. So this does feel like a very specific kind of experience, and I think most gamers probably it would be worth having this game in their collection because it's going to be something different than what they have elsewhere. Even if they have Mafia and Werewolf games, this takes it to a new level. So it's definitely a game that I am looking forward to seeking out and playing at some point. I don't know if it's a game that I'll acquire into my own collection because I tend to go to meetup groups, at least when the world is working properly, with players who play a lot of heavy Euros, and I tend to have groups to my house, but those are smaller groups. So it is not usual that I am part of a gaming group that has that range of 8 to 13 people. So while I am very interested to play this game and to see its strengths and be a part of it and witness how it plays, I think it's probably unlikely that I will acquire the game because I don't think it will have much opportunity to get played as a part of my collection in my home. But it seems really cool and very exciting, and so it's a game that I want to seek out and play at least once in 2022, assuming that we can get in groups of this size at some point this year. Boonlake is another game coming to retail. This is a game by Alexander Pfister. It's his new game. It is a game that I pre-ordered because, again, it's from Capstone Games, and it's currently slated to hit stores in February of this year. Alexander Pfister and Capstone. I've already told you how much I love Capstone and that they are my favorite retail publisher. Alexander Pfister is definitely one of my favorite designers. He's designed Mombasa, which is probably my favorite game of his, although that game is out of print. It has some colonialization themes, and so he is working on a redesign of that game this year that will take those themes out, kind of retheme it. I'm hearing chatter at maybe a space game, and he's also looking forward to that as an opportunity to add in some mechanical elements that he'd already thought about bringing into a new version of that game. So we're going to see some kind of announcement about a new Mombasa this year. Probably will have a new name and a new theme. I really, really, really love the old Mombasa, so I hope whatever changes that they make, it doesn't get too far away from the way the original game works mechanically. Pfister already did that once, really, where he rethemed Mombasa into Blackout Hong Kong, and I don't really like Blackout Hong Kong as much as Mombasa. It's a lighter game. I don't think it's as good a game. But Pfister's also designed stuff like Great Western Trail, Oh My Goods, Expedition to Newdale, Cloud Age, From Isle to Sky, Maracaibo, and this new game, Boonlake. It's a civilization and economic game. So the idea here is that players have found this area, Boonlake, that is undeveloped, uncivilized, and they're going to come in and they're going to develop it. It kind of operates away from the rest of the world. And some of the mechanics that you'll be seeing in Boonlake are contracts and worker placement and tile placement. So it's a new Alexander Pfister game. That's really all I need to know. I've got it pre-ordered. It's coming in February. I will be sharing it with you on the channel eventually. It's a game that I'm really looking forward to. Again, this one's probably in my top 10 retail games I'm looking forward to this year. Burncycle was on Kickstarter back in November of 2020. Now, this is not a game that I personally backed because at the time, money was tight. And Chip Theory Games, the same company that makes Cloudspire and Too Many Bones, they do an amazing job with their games. Their games are so good. I really like their design sensibility and their production behind it. The level of the components that they use are just off the charts amazing. The best design and components in all of board gaming. I mean, there are some things that are on their level, but I don't think that there's really anything that's above their level. Chip Theory Games is just the best, in my opinion. But they're also very expensive because of that. Lots of neoprene playmats, lots of custom etched dice, just lots of expansions, lots of cost. So I think when Burncycle first came out, I was either already into some very expensive Kickstarters or I think I may have just gone all into maybe Cloudspire, and so I just thought, oh, I can't spend this much on burncycle right now. But my financial situation was not so tight later on when I pledged the Hoplomachus games, and I was able to pledge burncycle as an add-on with those games. Now, that means that I won't be getting burncycle probably until May or later, because I will be getting it with my Hoplomachus pledge. But for most gamers, for gamers who actually pledged burncycle when that campaign was live, they should be getting their pledge of burncycle in March of this year. Now, like a lot of other chip theory games, this game is also going to use poker chips and dice rolling and neoprene mats, but it's a little bit of a divergence from chip theory games. Too Many Bones is kind of a dungeon crawler, but it uses poker chips and tactical combat battles. It's kind of almost an abstract game. And Cloudspire is essentially a tower defense game. And Hoplomachus is an arena game, a gladiator game, where you're fighting enemies in a gladiatorial arena with hexagonal tiles. So this game, Burncycle, features spies or secret agents, which in this case happens to be a team of robots. And they are breaking into human-run evil corporations and trying to take on certain missions of sabotage. They're going to be using action points and tech tracks, which are going to be tracked on neoprene mats with these little kind of punch markers. And it's a cooperative scenario and campaign-based game like most of their games. And it's going to use dice rolling and, of course, these really cool chunky neoprene mats. So I really like Chip Theory in general. I think they are one of the best board game companies out there. They are just producing games at the peak of what can be done. Really nice produced games with great components. And I think what attracts me to this game specifically is the very puzzling nature of it. Now, their other games are a puzzle as well. There's the tactical combat puzzle of Too Many Bones, as well as the puzzle of how you're going to upgrade your characters. Cloudspire has that with the way that you approach tower defense. They all have that to some degree. But this just feels a little bit more puzzly to me in the sense of, I don't know if you ever had games magazines back in the 80s, but these kinds of activity books or games that would start with things like Sudoku and crossword puzzles and those kinds of things, but have all different kinds of puzzles in it. This feels like that, where you're having to break into a corporation and use a series of mechanics to kind of go around and complete missions. It feels very puzzly in a way that is very specific and kind of unique that we haven't seen before. I don't know how it compares to something like, let's say, Burgle Brothers, but I think it's that kind of an idea, that action programming and actionability that you're using to carry out sort of a secret mission, and you need to use stealth in some way. And I think knowing the components of Chip Theory games and the way that they kind of handle things, I know it's going to be a very well-produced, physically interactive, just feels good to kind of handle the things and do it puzzle. So I'm really looking forward to Burncycle, and I am very happy that I was able to kind of come in later and get a pledge with it, even though I will be getting my copy of it a little later this year than everybody else. Carnegie Deluxe Edition was on Kickstarter in February of 2021. This is a game that I personally backed, and it is currently slated for delivery in March of this year. Now, interestingly enough, this game is designed by Xavier George, who is a designer that I don't particularly love or haven't in the past. So he has worked on games like Black Angel, Carson City, Ginkopolis, and Troyes. And I've played Troyes, and I think it was one of my worst gaming experiences ever. I would put it in my top 10 worst games of all time. That's how much I did not like Troyes. I just did not like the dice placement or the way dice got drafted and you kind of used the dice of other players, or the way that kind of enemies came in at the end of each round and players kind of had to protect against them. I've seen that mechanic used in other games, things like Kingsburg or A Game of Thrones, the board game. But for whatever reason, at least in our game of Troyes, we were really not incentivized to work together in any way. So it meant that any player, I guess, helping to keep these waves of baddies away was almost working against the group. So most of our group tended not to do it, and then we just got shellacked by the kind of oncoming waves of bad guys. And it felt to me when I played Twa that we were never really kind of making good choices. We were just trying to hold up a wall that was falling down. And it did not feel like a good game, a game that I enjoyed playing. However, I'm really, really interested and fascinated by Carnegie, and so I backed it, even though the designer made one of my least favorite games of all time. Now, it does have art by Ian O'Toole, who's one of my favorite artists of all time. He works on a lot of the Vital Lacerda games, so I knew it did have that going for it. It probably also helped that the game is about Andrew Carnegie, who's a very famous industrialist, turn of the century, and he had so much money that he was also this huge benefactor, and he did a lot of good with his money beyond, the industrialization of our country, which he was also a huge part of. The game's also a little bit interesting because it plays over 20 rounds, and players will only have one action per round. So one action, but 20 rounds of action. So it's going to be kind of a slow build of a game with a lot of pre-planning. Now, players are building up this kind of business empire over this game. They're going to be investing in real estate. They're going to be expanding their business. They're going to be creating transport chains. But I do like that this game, in addition to, kind of having this industrialism engine, there is also a focus on his philanthropic side. And like a lot of games that I've already mentioned so far in this list, it's interesting to see where this kind of awareness of the future and energy and being green, and thinking towards the future, planning for the future, how that's kind of filtering into games. So you've got some games that have a green legacy campaign where it's fully resettable, so it's less wasteful for the game. You've got another game called Earthborn Rangers, which I'll be talking about in a future video in this series, where they're trying to produce it in a very environmentally conscious way, to the point that some of the components even changed post-campaign. And then you've got games like this one and Ark Nova, where there is some awareness of that kind of thinking that has filtered through into the very design of the game and the kinds of actions that players will be taking and the way that players need to be thinking while they're playing the game. And I think that's really smart. I love the way that board games get us, kind of juggling multiple plates and maybe thinking about half a dozen different mechanical systems at the same time. I think it's very useful for us in our own lives to be able to kind of multitask different systems, as well as kind of seeing how they interplay together. And I think anything that is taking in a certain level of awareness towards how we need to be thinking towards our future to survive as a species and implementing that into a game, so the players, as they play the game, also need to be thinking about those kinds of choices, I'm all for that. I think that's helpful to us in many, many ways beyond just board gaming. Chai Tea for Two was on Kickstarter in June of 2021. This is a game that I personally backed, and it is currently slated to deliver in February of this year, although I have a feeling that they may be pushed a month or two, just because their previous campaign, which was Chai High Tea, which is kind of a sequel expansion for Chai, that had some issues. What campaign doesn't, right? And that got pushed back. And it is possible that as a result, Chai Tea for Two may still get a little bit of a residual pushback as well. Now, I did not back the original Chai because while it looked really well produced with fantastic components, kind of great design choices, at least visually, it seemed a little bit too light of a game for me. So it was something that I would like to still play at some point, but it feels like a very simple set collection game, kind of back and forth, and not something that I really need in my collection. It's just a little too simple for me in the kinds of games that I like to play. However, I did like the production style of it, and it seemed for the kind of game that it was, they had really done it right. And so when I heard about Chai Tea for Two, I heard that it was more complex and crunchier than the original game, and I also found out that it was specifically a two-player experience. So I thought, okay, this is kind of a good time for me to jump into the series. As a two-player game, it's something that I certainly can play with my fiancée, Kristen. I will know that it's going to play well at two players because it is designed as a two-player only game. And I like the idea that it has some more mechanics and some more crunch behind it than the original Chai. I do know that it has dice worker placement, and it has 5 different unique action boards in the game. It's also a card game, it has tableau building, and there's also pick up and deliver in the game. So a nice group of lighter mechanics. I don't expect Chai Tifa 2 to be a super heavy game. I just expect it to hopefully give me a little bit more to think about choice-wise than the original game. But I'm very much looking forward to playing it when it delivers and to sharing my thoughts about it with you all. Circadians Chaos Order was just on Kickstarter in November of 2021. This is a game that I personally backed, and it is set to deliver in July. Now, not only did I back Chaos Order, but I took this opportunity to back the other game in the series, Circadians First Light. This is a new trilogy of games by Garpell Games that does the Of the North Seas and Of the West Kingdoms trilogies. They just announced an Of the South Seas trilogy coming in that. So by the time they've finished that, they're going to have 4 different fantasy-themed trilogies. And I know that South Seas is planning on traveling into a different part of the world than the North Seas or West Kingdom, and they're going to be looking at cultures that are less Anglo, but they're already midway into this science fiction trilogy. Now, the science fiction trilogy is designed by S.J. McDonald, who came on board with Shem Phillips with the Of the West Kingdom games and helped him design those as a co-designer. With the Circadians trilogies, he's worked as a solo designer on the first game, and now he has a co-designer on the second game. So the first game in the series, First Light, is a worker placement game. It's been out now for about a year and a half. It didn't really land with that much reception, I think partly because it delivered in the middle of the pandemic, and it doesn't have the same sort of pedigree or name brand recognition that his Of the North Seas or West Kingdom games have. So this one's kind of like the cousin who's somewhat ignored. But the first game in the series, First Light, was a worker placement game like a lot of Garpell Games' other games. This newest game is not. It's a game for 1 to 6 players, and it has asymmetric factions. And I hear that the game plays really well at higher player counts. It's almost better at higher player counts where things get a little bit crazy. But it's got asymmetric factions, it's got action drafting, there's engine building, and there's area control, but there's no worker placement. So it's a little bit of a different game for Garpell Games. Now, the art here is by Sam Phillips. He's been working with Garpell Games as well. He did the first game in the series, First Light, 2 other games for Garpell, but these were games that didn't go to Kickstarter, but just went to retail. And they are Hadrian's Wall and Raiders of Scythia. So if you've seen the art for any of those games, or for the first Circadians game, you know what the art will look like for Chaos Order. The other thing is they've gone back and kind of redone a lot of the art for First Light. Same artist, but they've redone the art, and it looks just better graphic design. It's a little bit snazzier. So if you backed First Light through this campaign, you'll be getting the second edition, which has kind of cleaned up graphic design and same artist, but arguably just better, snappier, more cleaned up art. But I'm a big fan of Garpell Games. I think they make remarkably consistent, kind of mid-level Euros, usually worker placement games. So I am very excited to finally be able to play both First Light and Chaos Order when these deliver, hopefully in July of this year. City of the Great Machine was on Kickstarter in October of 2021. This is not a game that I personally backed, and they are currently shooting to deliver in November of this year. So this one has a Victorian steampunk theme to it, as well as Arkeis, which I mentioned previously. But this one was out very recently, so it wasn't out at the same time as Arkeis. I wasn't, kind of looking between those two when I was deciding which to back. City of the Great Machine just finished its campaign recently. So I like the theming behind it. It is a one versus many game, though, which is a little more difficult for me to get to the table. Someone has to play the one, someone has to know how to play the one, and then you need to have a big enough group to play the many. So if you're just doing one-on-one, playing those games with the one versus many isn't as exciting, and in some games it doesn't even really work. So you need at least 3 players. And I just think that in my collection, one versus many games aren't going to get out to the table too much. Also, the more that I looked at this looked a little bit light for my collection. So I think with the players that I would maybe play a one versus many game, they want a mechanically heavier game, my gamer friends. So all of that I think were ultimately the reasons that I passed on this game, but there's a lot that I like about this game and I think looks very cool, and I really do want to get a chance to play it this year. It's a team-based game. It uses an action queue and a modular board. Essentially, in this game, one player is going to play the Great Machine, who is trying to finish his master plans, and the other players are trying to stop him in this Victorian steampunk-themed world. Creature Comforts was on Kickstarter in November of 2020. Now, it's not a game that I personally backed. I'll get to that in just a moment. But it is aiming at delivering in March of this year. So this is a game that is being published by Kids Table BG. They made a game that I did back called Fossilis, and I was very, very, very impressed by Fossilis because I thought the design and the mechanics, it's designed by David Diaz, by the way. David Diaz, you did an amazing job with Fossilis. I see David all over social media a lot. He does videos for other campaigns, but he just did an amazing job with Fossilis, and I remain forever impressed by it. But what Fossilis did was it created a game that had great mechanics, and as a heavier Euro gamer, I felt like I was very involved in that game. Like, it had everything that I needed. But it is designed for children. And there are ways in that game to take out different elements that children may not like, including like the take that elements. So cards that are kind of more take that-y than other cards are labeled in a certain way, and they make it very easy for you to take those cards out of the game. There are also a lot of little modular expansions that as you play the game and you become more familiar with it, you can add in these modular expansions, and they'll give you sometimes more difficulty in the game, but more often than not, just more variability. But what I really liked about it was Fossilis was so well designed in the base game. It gave such a great experience, but then it had all these little modular expansions, and more than anything, it had a system, a way for parents to be able to take that game and customize it for whatever level of gaming that their children are or were ready for. And I just thought it was so well done. Now, Kids Table BG is the same entity that is producing this game, Creature Comforts, but that company has another name, and that is Burnt Island Games, and under that moniker, they produce games like Endeavor Age of Expansion, In the Hall of the Mountain King, and Fall of the Mountain King. So they kind of have their feet in two different worlds. They're doing a really good job with both, I think, but I am very impressed by the Kids Table BG line, at least from what I saw with Fossilis, which is why I am highlighting this game on this list. Now, the designer here is new, so I can't really talk about the designer's previous games. I can say that the game includes mechanics like card drafting, dice rolling, set collection, and worker placement with dice workers. I can also tell you that there are very, very cute animal meeples, and it looks thematically somewhat similar to Everdell. Also, players will be using 3 different seasons, spring, summer, and fall, to kind of prepare their animals for winter and stockpile everything up for winter hibernation. So that's kind of the theme of the game, and it does have some mechanics and bear some similarity in looks to something like Everdell. I don't think that it's as complex a Euro as Everdell is, even though Everdell is not that complex. But I think it has very attractive and enticing component and production design behind it, and it has some similar theming to Everdell. And I think that will only work to its advantage, because with Kids Table BG behind it, I think Creature Comfort is going to be a very good, solid game. And I think any kind of very superficial seeming similarities in theming will pull people in. It'll get them to try the game. And I believe that the game is good enough that once they do, it will stand on its own. So I do really want to play this one. I want to see if it's as good as it looks. I think it's probably too light of a game for me to have in my collection. But I think for a lot of families or gamers who like kind of medium-light games, this game is going to be really, really good and something that you don't want to ignore. You want to take a look at it, see if this one's going to be right for you and for your collection. Cryptid Urban Legends is a retail game. It is coming later this year. Right now, it's looking like it's going to come in April. It's not something that I've pre-ordered yet. It is a game that I'm curious about. I'm going to try to play. I don't know whether I'll add it to my collection or not. But let me tell you why I'm interested in it. So the game Cryptid was published in 2018. It is sort of a deduction game where players are searching for a different monster. Things like the Loch Ness Monster, the Jersey Devil. It plays 3 to 5 players, so it is kind of one of these deduction hidden movement games like a Whitehall Mystery or a Jack the Ripper, and it needs that higher player count because one player is controlling the cryptid and the other players are looking for it. Now, it was published in 2018, and it currently sits on Board Game Geek with a 7.5. But I think, when you're playing a game like this, inevitably players say, well, wait a minute, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I'm holed up with my significant other. We would like to play Cryptid. We cannot because it requires 3 players. What do we do? Here is your answer, Cryptid Urban Legends, which is exclusively a two-player game. So it is designed by Hal Duncan and Ruth Vevers, which are the same designers as the original. It also has art by Kwanchi Moriya, who did the art on the original. I love his art. I think he's one of the best board game artists working today. His art is just so stylized. It's kind of chunky in a certain kind of a way. If you've seen it, you'd know it. It stands out. He also did the art on a game that we'll be talking about later in this video series called So You've Been Eaten. But I do know that he's done work on games. I think he did Terror Below. I know he did Curious Cargo. I know he did the new Sidereal Confluence. He's done Dinosaur Island. Really, really great artist with really attractive art. So he's definitely a reason for me to pick this up. And the fact that it is a 2-player game where one player is playing the cryptid, the other player is searching for the cryptid, and it is essentially an asymmetric game of competitive logic and reasoning. Now, it is a very specific type of game because one player is playing the scientist, the other player is playing the cryptid. It's really going to depend all on how tight and how well this game was designed. But I have a good feeling about it. I think having the original designers and artists working on this, we should have high expectations. And I'm definitely going to be looking at this when it comes out, seeing if it looks good. And if it's as good as I think it will be, it's something that I'll be at least looking to play and possibly acquiring either for my collection and or just to be able to show you guys as a part of this channel. And we've reached the final game for this video, and that is Darkest Dungeon, the board game. Now, this is a game that was on Kickstarter in November of 2020. This is not a game that I personally backed because at the time that it was out, there was a lot of stuff on Kickstarter, and I'm a big fan of the video game. I really like it. It's a roguelike where you're taking a group of various kind of fantasy themed characters, like a tanky character, a rogue, some damage dealers, healers, into a dungeon, and you are fighting things on, kind of a platformer type screen, so side-scrolling screen. And you're going through with this group of adventurers, and you will get into different combats and dungeons. You'll get hit by traps, but most importantly, you will also suffer, kind of terror and possible insanity. And the idea here in the video game is that as you go through these dungeons, your team is not going to survive that well. And so what you'll need to do is create multiple teams, send them down into different dungeons, have them explore and kind of get things back, level up their characters. And eventually, when they go mad and die, you can kind of pilfer their teams to make new teams and create stronger and stronger teams from their adventurer team residue, I suppose. So it's a roguelike in that sense where you're using the skills and the findings of previous teams to power up later teams. So I like it a lot as a video game, and I see how it could be implemented well as a board game. I also see how it could be trying very hard to kind of mimic the video game and not successfully translating that experience over. So I did have some worries about the board game version. There are also a lot of miniatures in the board game version. It's a very miniatures heavy, and I think that made the price very high. And there were a lot of other big miniature games at the time. And for me, I'd rather go in and play, an exploratory dungeon crawler with combat, where you're kind of going on this mission. I don't necessarily need Darkest Dungeon, the board game. I'd almost rather just go play the video game. But I have been very curious about it. And I think that the graphic element of it, the art, looks very faithful from the board art itself to the miniatures. So I'm really, really curious to see if they've pulled this off and if they've made a good game. It doesn't help the fact that it's being designed by relative unknown designers and a publisher, so there's a huge question mark out there for this. Now also, it was originally supposed to deliver in November of 2021. There has not been an update as to when it's going to deliver now. I think it can be safely said that it's going to deliver in 2022. I don't think they're going to go more than a whole year of delay, but they haven't narrowed down and given a specific window. So the most specific thing that I can pass along to you is just that it is supposed to deliver now in 2022. And like its video game predecessor, it's a dungeon crawler. It's a cooperative game. It is a campaign game, so theoretically, you're going to be taking your heroes on some kind of campaign and probably, like the video game, using failed campaigns to construct later, stronger campaigns. That's what I'm guessing. And it will use miniatures, lots of miniatures, and dice rolling. So in the video game, a lot of this RNG is kind of just done behind the scenes. Players will be dice rolling to recreate that level of, attacking, will they hit, things like that. The stuff that was kind of done behind the scenes by the video game will be done by players using dice. So I'm really curious when this one comes out to take a look at it, maybe try to get my hands on it and play it, and see if it's something that I will regret not backing. But for now, while I'm really interested in it and really want to see if they pulled it off, I still do feel content in not having backed it and waiting perhaps until later to see if I want to maybe cycle back around on a later Kickstarter campaign, if there is one, and if this game is proven to be really, really good. And until then, just kind of biding my time and waiting and watching and seeing how it lands when it's delivered and what other people think of it and how it's received and how it plays in more detail. But I'm very curious about it. I think Darkest Dungeon is a really interesting IP and video game series, and I'm curious and hopeful that they've pulled off the board game adaptation in a way that is compelling and will make me either regret not having backed it or, rush out to back it on a future campaign, or to try to track down a copy of this game at retail if it does go to retail. And I don't even know what kind of shape it'll be in. It might not have all of this stuff. I think it's unlikely that it would have all of the Kickstarter stuff at retail. So again, for me, if I decide that I do want to procure it later, it may be a case of trying to hunt it down or jumping on a later Kickstarter. Anyway, that is the first 20 games of my top 100 most anticipated games of 2022. Thank you very much for watching. I hope I gave you some food for thought and some things to think about during the coming year, games that maybe weren't on your radar that now are, things you don't want to miss, or things that perhaps are not for you. The remaining 4 videos in this series should be coming out over the next week and a half, probably one new video every day or two. And while I'm continuing with this series, I will have a new Kickstarter weekly coming out, so you can watch for that. And then upon finishing this series, I likely will put out my Game of the Month videos for November and December of 2021 before eventually getting into my Game of the Month for January. So keep coming back to the channel, like this video if you like it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and keep your eyes peeled for the remaining 80 games in 4 videos in this series. Have a great week, play lots of great games, and I will see you all very, very soon. Take care.